The Great Upheaval of 1946 and the American Dream. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The Great Compression and the New Social Contract. The Great Strike Wave of 1946 did not end in violent revolution. Instead, it resulted in a historic compromise that fundamentally reshaped American society. Born from the terror of 1946 was a society so prosperous and equitable that it would have been dismissed as utopian fantasy just a decade earlier. The period that followed, from roughly 1947 to the early 1970s, is known by economists as the Great Compression. It was an era defined by a new, unwritten social contract between big labor, big business, and the federal government. It was this new social contract of labor stability, increasing real wages, and narrowing income disparity that produced a superior economic performance, a development so revolutionary that it amounted to a complete transformation of the American social order. Economic inequality, as measured by wealth and income distribution between the elites and the working class, was the least since America industrialized. This was a monumental achievement. It made America great. This new contract transformed American life and created the modern middle class. 1. A new standard of living. Unions gained strength and legitimacy. The strikes resulted in significant wage gains, often between 15 and 20%. This set a pattern. For the next quarter century, American workers could expect regular and increasing real wages, often tied to productivity gains and cost of living adjustments, COLAs. Social equity, long a pipe dream, gained institutional traction. 2. New norms of employment. The 40-hour workweek with overtime pay became the national standard. Paid holidays, pensions, and sick leave became the norm. Job security and seniority rights were entrenched. The expectation of steady, long-term, and perhaps even permanent employment with a single large employer was widespread for millions. 3. The birth of the benefits package. Crucially, benefits that were once the exclusive domain of the wealthy became widespread. Employer-sponsored healthcare plans, paid holidays, paid vacations, and company-funded pensions became standard components of a union contract. While universal healthcare remained elusive, millions gained coverage through union-bargained benefits. 4. The blue-collar middle class. For the first time in history, it became possible to achieve a comfortable, middle-class existence with only a high school education. American factory workers began to own their own suburban homes, drive new cars, and purchase consumer goods. 5. Access to higher education. This newfound prosperity, combined with the GI Bill, allowed the children of the working class to attend college in unprecedented numbers, fueling further social mobility and economic growth. Narrowing inequality. Income inequality declined markedly. A federal minimum wage was enforced and raised. Real wages grew steadily from the late 1940s through the early 1970s. The working class finally shared in the American bounty. Productivity gains translated into wage gains. CEOs might still live lavishly, but workers now lived with dignity. The beauty of this arrangement was its elegant simplicity. The workers, having discovered that they possessed the power to shut down the entire economy, were suddenly treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for mythical heroes. The employers, having discovered that prosperous workers were also enthusiastic consumers, found that paying decent wages was not merely morally satisfying, but highly profitable. The result was a society of shared prosperity. Income inequality plummeted to its lowest levels in modern history. The new social contract, born from the fire of 1946, created a period of labor stability and economic dynamism that became the envy of the world. The mythological aftermath. The ruling classes, having been forced to abandon their cherished tradition of worker oppression, responded with the kind of creative mythology that would have impressed the ancient Greeks. They began to propagandize the notion that America had always been the land of opportunity, a claim so audaciously false that it achieved the kind of artistic perfection usually found only in the finest fiction, Hollywood. That magnificent dream factory went into overdrive to convince Americans that their newly prosperous circumstances were the natural result of American exceptionalism rather than the hard-won fruit of organized rebellion. The American dream was born, not from reality, but from the desperate need to explain away the embarrassing fact that workers' lives had improved dramatically only after they had threatened to burn down the entire system. The cosmic joke was that the same people who had spent decades explaining why worker prosperity was impossible suddenly began taking credit for creating it. They had discovered, with the innocent wonder of children claiming credit for the sunrise, that being forced to do the right thing was indistinguishable from choosing to do it. Chapter 7: The Eternal Return, Crisis, Rebirth, and the Rhythms of Upheaval. As we contemplate this magnificent tale of fortuitous victory, we might pause to consider its implications for our current moment. If Neil Howe is correct, we are once again approaching a fourth turning, another crisis that will test the fundamental assumptions of our social order. According to Neil Howe and William Strauss, in the fourth turning, history moves in cycles, 4 turnings, or generational seasons. The fourth turning is the crisis phase, a period of institutional upheaval, revolution, or war that clears the ground for a new order. The labor uprising of 1946 was a classic fourth turning moment. It was the culmination of years of institutional rot and generational pain, from the dislocations of the Great Depression to the collective trauma of World War II. The upheaval shattered the old order, the hyper-exploitative industrial model, and birthed a new consensus rooted in social equity, regulated capitalism, and working-class inclusion. Just as the Civil War and the American Revolution were fourth turnings that remade the nation, the post-war labor revolt rewrote the social contract. The silent generation and early boomers grew up in its shadow, reaping the benefits of its victories. The Great Strike Wave of 1946 was not a separate event, but the climax and resolution of that fourth turning. It was the final great domestic confrontation that determined what new civic order would replace the old one. The threat of drafting strikers and the fear of revolution and civil war represented the peak of the crisis. The eventual settlement and the establishment of the new social contract was the founding moment of the next era's high. The post-war boom, the Great Compression, and the rise of the American middle class, roughly 1946 to 1964, is a first turning that followed the crisis. It was an era built upon the institutional arrangements forged in the crucible of 1946. The GI generation, having survived the Depression and won the war, became the hero archetype that built this new, stable, and prosperous world, defined by strong unions, strong corporations, and a strong government mediating between them. It was these children, born during and after the Second World War, the first turning generation of Americans, who grew up in an atmosphere of hope. For the first time in American history, citizens reported hope for the future and expected their children's lives to be better than their own. None of these sentiments having existed prior to this. It was only the universal and almost uncontrollable labor revolt and genuine fear of a widespread and total public uprising that produced these massive social changes that resulted in the creation of the American middle class. All this was the result of America's brief transformation from a brutal free-market capitalist society to a socialist democracy, producing a period of unprecedented economic growth. The question, of course, is whether the current generation of workers will rediscover the cosmic truth that their predecessors learned in the decades leading to 1946, that the world belongs to those who have the courage to shut it down. The ruling classes, having spent the last several decades dismantling the achievements of that earlier uprising, seem determined to replay the same comedy, apparently unaware that the joke, ultimately, is always on them. Conclusion. Labor's triumph and lessons for today. History, as they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme scheme of American labor relations has a certain poetic inevitability that would amuse even the most jaded observer of human folly. The only question is whether the next uprising will be as magnificently comprehensive as the last one, or whether it will achieve the kind of cosmic comedy that makes even the gods laugh. In the end, the great strike wave of 1946 stands as a testament to the most fundamental truth of human existence, that the universe has a sense of humor, and that the biggest joke of all is usually played on those who take themselves most seriously. The American ruling class learned this lesson the hard way in 1946, and if current trends continue, they may have the opportunity to learn it again. One can only hope that the next performance will be as entertaining as the last. The Great Strike Wave of 1946 is one of the most consequential and overlooked events in American history. It was far more than a series of labor disputes. It was the moment when the American working class, empowered by its critical role in winning the war, stood up and demanded its share of the peace. They were a collective declaration that the sacrifices of war had to be matched by justice at home. They were successful not because they were polite, but because they were massive, militant, and unmistakably moral. Faced with total societal breakdown, the nation's elites forged a new contract that produced the most equitable and prosperous period in their history. This was the moment that, for millions, prosperity became a tangible reality, defining the character and trajectory of the nation for a generation, and proving that in the aftermath of a great crisis, a new and better world can be built. Today, the memory of 1946 still flickers, a candle of possibility in the dark, a reminder that the world can be remade when the many unite against the few. And if Neil Howe is correct, we are once again in a fourth turning. History's hourglass has flipped. A new reckoning is underway. Let us hope that the next rising of the working class, when it comes, will remember 1946, not just as a year of strikes, but as the year the working class stood up and won.